My ex-fiancée emptied our joint savings account to fund a luxury trip with her lover. Every dollar, gone in one transfer on a Tuesday morning, while I was in a client meeting 3 floors above the bank that processed it. She thought that transfer ended things on her terms. She thought she was walking away clean, with my money in her hand and my name already fatting from her mouth. She never read the paperwork. 18 months earlier, when we opened that account together, her own father had insisted on a $2 million overdraft line attached to it, tied directly to his construction company's credit, because he wanted his daughter protected no matter what happened to me. He built that safety net to protect her. He never imagined she would be the one to swing it open and fall straight through it. She drained the balance and walked into a 5-star resort in Turks and Caicos, believing she had taken everything from me. What she actually did was open a $2 million liability in her own name, attached to her own father's business, and she did it 48 hours before his company's annual credit review. By the time her flight landed, the bank had already made the first call. Like this video right now. Subscribe to this channel and ring the bell before we go any further, because you are not going to want to miss where this one ends up. My name is Daniel Voss, and I am 36 years old. I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania, in a narrow 2-story house on a street called Parade Street that sat close enough to the lake that the winters came in off the water and stayed for 6 months at a time. My father, Raymond Voss, worked as a machinist at a plant that made components for rail equipment. He worked the same line for 26 years, came home smelling like cutting oil, and sat down to dinner at 5:40 every night without fail because that was when the second shift whistle blew, and that was when a man who worked with his hands was allowed to stop. My mother, Denise, cleaned houses 3 days a week for families on the east side of the city who had more money than we did, and who treated her, for the most part, with the specific kind of politeness that people extended to someone whose labor they depended on but did not think about very often. She came home tired in a way that was different from tired. She came home tired in the way of someone who had spent the day being invisible in other people's houses. I was an only child. That mattered more than people usually expect it to. There was no older sibling to absorb some of my parents' attention, and no younger one to divide it further. Whatever they had to give, I got directly, and what they had to give was not money, and it was not connections, and it was not the specific kind of confidence that comes from growing up around people who already had what you wanted. What they gave me was the plain fact of their reliability. My father never missed a shift in 26 years except for the week his own father died. My mother never told a client she couldn't make it. I grew up understanding, in the specific way a child understands things without being told them directly, that showing up was not a virtue in our house. It was the baseline. It was the entry fee for being taken seriously. I was a decent student, not an exceptional one, until 10th grade, when a guidance counselor named Mrs. Aldrich pulled me into her office because my aptitude scores in mathematics and logical reasoning had come back in a range. She said she saw maybe once every few years. She said, "Daniel, you have the kind of mind that sees the structure underneath a problem instead of just the problem. That is worth developing." I did not fully understand what she meant at the time. I understood it completely 15 years later. I went to Penn State on a combination of a partial academic scholarship, a Pell Grant, and a part-time job doing IT support for the university's housing department, which paid $11 an hour and taught me more about how large institutional systems actually worked than any class I took. I studied finance and information systems, a combination that seemed unglamorous at the time, and that turned out to be exactly the combination the world needed a decade later, when finance and technology stopped being separate things. I graduated in 2012 into a job market that was still recovering from the crash, with $11,000 in student debt and no family connections in any industry that mattered. I moved to Pittsburgh because it was the closest city with real financial sector jobs, and because the rent was survivable on an entry-level salary. I took a job as a junior analyst at a regional bank called Three Rivers Financial Group, doing credit risk modeling for their commercial lending division. It was unglamorous work. I built spreadsheets. I ran default probability models. I sat in a cubicle on the fourth floor of a building downtown and learned, methodically and without any illusions about how exciting it was, exactly how banks decided who to trust with money and how much and under what conditions. I was good at it for the same reason I had been good at the aptitude test in 10th grade. I could see the structure underneath the numbers. I could look at a company's financials and understand not just what they said, but what they were built to hide. And more importantly, what specific mechanism made a lending relationship safe or dangerous regardless of what the surface numbers claimed. My supervisor in those first years was a woman named Carol Petrosky, 54 years old, 22 years at the bank, who had the specific hard-won patience of someone who had trained a dozen junior analysts and had learned exactly how much rope to give each one before they either rose to it or didn't. She called me into her office 8 months into the job. She had a credit memo I had written in her hand. She said, "This recommendation goes against what the relationship manager wants." I said, "The relationship manager wants the deal to close. I am telling you what the collateral structure actually protects and what it doesn't." She said, "You know that makes you unpopular in this building." I said, "I would rather be unpopular and correct than popular and responsible for a bad loan on the books in 3 years." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "That is the only correct answer to that sentence I have ever heard from someone in your seat." She backed my recommendation. The deal got restructured with better collateral terms before it closed. 2 years later, when the borrower's business hit exactly the kind of trouble my memo had flagged as a risk, the bank's exposure was a fraction of what it would have been under the original terms. Carol became the person who taught me the actual architecture of institutional lending, not the textbook version, the real version. Overdraft protection lines, cross-collateralization, the specific way a guarantor's exposure could sit quietly in the background of an account for years without anyone thinking about it, until the exact moment when it mattered more than anything else in the file. I want you to remember that phrase. It is going to matter later. By 2017, I had been promoted twice and was managing a portfolio of mid-sized commercial accounts on my own. I was 27 years old, making a real salary for the first time in my life, and I had started, cautiously and methodically, to build the kind of financial foundation that nobody in my family had ever had the opportunity to build. I maxed out my retirement contributions. I paid off my student debt 18 months ahead of schedule. I put money into index funds on a schedule as regular as my father's shift bell. I was not flashy. I drove a 6-year-old Honda. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Lawrenceville that cost less than what some of my colleagues spent on parking. I was building something quietly, the way my father had built 26 years of reliability, one unremarkable shift at a time. That was the year I met Vanessa Kessler. Vanessa walked into a fundraising gala for a Pittsburgh Children's Hospital in October of 2017, wearing a dark green dress, and she had the specific quality of someone who had grown up believing that rooms organized themselves around her presence rather than the other way around. She was 29. She worked in event planning for a boutique firm that handled weddings and corporate functions for Pittsburgh's more affluent families, and she was there that night both working the event and attending it, moving between the two roles with a fluency that impressed me before she ever said a word to me. I was there because Three Rivers Financial Group had a table, and because Carol had specifically told me to attend and to talk to people instead of standing in the corner with a drink, which was my natural instinct at any function requiring a suit. Vanessa approached our table during the cocktail hour, not because she was interested in me specifically, but because she was doing her job, checking that the tables were satisfied, making the specific practiced small talk of someone paid to make an evening run smoothly. She said, "Is everything working for your group?" I said, "Everything is fine. You clearly know what you're doing." She looked at me for a beat longer than the question required. She said, "Most people don't notice the mechanics. They just notice if something goes wrong." I said, "I notice mechanics for a living." She said, "What do you do?" I said, "Credit risk analysis. I look at companies and figure out exactly where the actual risk is hiding, underneath what they want you to see." She said, "That sounds like a useful skill to have around people, not just companies." I laughed. She smiled the specific smile of someone who had said something calculated and was pleased it landed. We talked for 20 minutes before she had to go handle a problem with the dessert table. She gave me her number before she left. I called her 3 days later, the way my father had taught me to handle anything that mattered, not immediately, not too late, at the correct interval that signaled genuine interest without desperation. We went on our first date to a restaurant in the Strip District. She talked, at length and with real skill, about her work, about the families she worked for, about the specific texture of Pittsburgh's old money and new money, and how they wanted completely different things from an event, and how she had learned to give each of them what they actually wanted rather than what they said they wanted. I found this genuinely impressive. It was a different domain from mine, but it was the same underlying skill, seeing the structure underneath what people presented on the surface. I did not, in that first dinner, learn very much about her family. I learned that over the following months, in pieces, the way you learn most important things about a person. Her father, Gordon Kessler, owned a mid-sized commercial construction company based just outside Pittsburgh called Kessler Building Group. 41 employees. Annual revenue in the range of $18 to $22 million depending on the year, doing commercial build-outs, warehouse construction, and a growing municipal contracting business that Gordon had spent a decade cultivating relationships to win. Gordon had built the company from a 2-truck operation in the early 1990s. He was, by every account Vanessa gave me, and by every account I later confirmed through my own professional channels, a genuinely competent operator, disciplined about margins, careful about which jobs he bid on, unwilling to overextend the company's balance sheet for the sake of growth for its own sake. He was also, and this detail mattered enormously later, a client of Three Rivers Financial Group. Not my client directly. His relationship manager was a colleague named Phil Danziger, 2 cubicles down from mine, who handled the Kessler Building Group's commercial credit facilities and had for 9 years. I did not know this when I met Vanessa. I found out about 6 weeks into dating her when she mentioned her father's company by name over dinner, and something in the back of my mind flagged it as familiar. I checked the following Monday, discreetly, the way any analyst would check a name that crossed their personal life. Gordon Kessler's company banked with my employer. His relationship manager sat 2 cubicles from mine. I had, in fact, seen the Kessler Building Group's name on internal credit committee summaries before, in the unremarkable way you see dozens of client names pass through a bank's internal systems without any of them meaning anything specific to you. I told Vanessa about the connection. She said, "That's a small world." I said, "It's a small industry in a mid-sized city. It happens more than people think." She said, "Does that make things complicated for us?" I said, "Only if I ever handled his account directly, which I don't and won't, since Phil manages that relationship. I'll just need to be careful never to discuss anything about his business with you, and you should understand that even if I knew something, I couldn't tell you." She said, "That's very by the book of you." I said, "It's the only way to do this job for more than 5 years." She seemed to accept this. I want to be honest and say that in retrospect, I have wondered whether that conversation planted something in her mind rather than closing a door, whether she filed away the information that her fiancé worked at the same institution that held her father's credit lines and understood, long before I did, that this fact might someday be useful to her. I did not think that at the time. At the time, I thought I had met someone remarkable, and I proceeded the way I proceeded with everything important, carefully, and completely. We were engaged in the spring of 2019, after 2 years together. I proposed at the restaurant where we'd had our first date, with a ring I had saved for over 8 months, choosing a stone that was honest about what I could afford rather than one that performed a wealth I did not have. Vanessa said yes. Her parents hosted an engagement dinner at their house in Fox Chapel, a genuinely beautiful property that Gordon had built with his own company's crews over the better part of a decade, adding to it as the business grew. Gordon shook my hand with the specific firm, assessing grip of a man who had spent 30 years evaluating subcontractors and knew within the first 3 seconds of a handshake roughly what kind of person he was dealing with. He said, "Vanessa tells me you're in banking." I said, "Credit risk analysis, commercial lending side." He said, "Which bank?" I told him. Something in his face shifted, very slightly, the specific micro-expression of a man doing quick mental arithmetic about what this meant for him. He said, "Small world." I said, "That's what Vanessa said too." He said, "You don't handle my accounts, do you?" I said, "No, sir. That's Phil Danziger's book. I've never touched your file and I never will as long as I'm with Vanessa. I want to be completely clear about that boundary from day one." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "I appreciate you saying that directly. Most people wouldn't think to." That was the beginning of what I believed, for the next 2 years, was a genuine mutual respect between Gordon Kessler and me. Continuing right where we left off, here's the rest of the script. We set a wedding date for September of 2021, giving ourselves a little over 2 years to plan, which in the world Vanessa worked in was considered a reasonable but not extravagant runway. Vanessa wanted a wedding that reflected the kind of families she worked for professionally, and there was a natural, unspoken tension in the 18 months that followed between what her parents were prepared to fund, what I was prepared to contribute, and what she actually wanted the final event to look like. I want to be honest about something here, because the honest version is the only version worth telling. I loved Vanessa, genuinely. In the early years, she was funny in a sharp, specific way, and she was competent at her work in a way I found attractive, and she paid close attention to me in the specific fashion of someone who wanted to understand what mattered to a person rather than just performing interest in them. What I did not see clearly enough in those early years was the second layer underneath that attentiveness, that Vanessa's attention was also always a form of information gathering. She learned what mattered to people not only because she cared, but because knowing what mattered to someone was the most reliable form of leverage a person could hold, and Vanessa had grown up in a household where leverage was simply how things got done. Gordon proposed, in the spring of 2020, that he wanted to set Vanessa and me up with a joint account specifically for wedding expenses and early marriage savings, separate from either of our individual accounts, funded partly by a wedding contribution from him and partly by contributions Vanessa and I would make ourselves. He suggested we open it at 3 Rivers Financial Group, since it was the bank he already trusted and had a 2-decade relationship with. I raised at the time a mild concern. I said, "Gordon, given that I work there, I want to be extremely careful that this account is handled entirely by Phil or by someone else on the personal banking side, and that I have absolutely no professional visibility into it. I don't want even the appearance of a conflict." Gordon said, "I appreciate that. I already thought about it. I want to set it up with something specific attached to it, actually, and I want you both to understand exactly what it is before we do it. He explained that he wanted to attach an overdraft protection facility to the joint account, structured as a $2 million line, secured against Kessler Building Group's existing credit relationship with the bank, rather than against any asset of mine or Vanessa's personally. I said, "Gordon, that's an enormous number for a personal account. Why would you want that kind of exposure sitting on a wedding savings account?" He said, "Because I've been in business 30 years, and the thing I've learned is that emergencies don't ask permission before they show up. I want my daughter protected if something happens, a medical thing, a job loss, anything. And I don't want her ever calling me at midnight because a small account ran dry at the worst possible moment. The line sits there. It probably never gets touched. But if it's ever needed, it's there instantly, without a conversation, without anyone having to ask me for anything." I said, "This is a very generous thing to do. I want to make sure you understand the mechanism completely, because I look at facilities like this for a living. If that overdraft is ever drawn down, the liability attaches immediately to the joint account holders. And because it's secured against your company's credit line rather than a separate personal guarantee, it also creates a direct linkage between whatever happens on this account and your business's credit standing with the bank." Gordon said, "I understand the mechanism, Daniel. I've been collateralizing credit facilities for 30 years. I'm not worried about it because I trust the people who would have access to that account." I said, "I want that on the record then, because I think it's important Vanessa understands it too." We sat down, the three of us, with Phil Danziger the following week, and Phil walked through the actual paperwork. I remember this meeting with total clarity, because it is the meeting that eventually decided everything. Phil explained, "The overdraft facility is structured as a revolving line, secured against Kessler Building Group's master credit agreement. Draws against the personal account are treated, for regulatory and risk purposes, as draws against the company's line. Any draw over $5,000 triggers an automatic notification to the commercial relationship manager, which is me, and any draw over $50,000 triggers a mandatory credit review of the underlying secured facility, meaning Kessler Building Group's entire credit relationship gets re-examined, regardless of the company's own standalone performance." Gordon said, "That's exactly the safeguard I wanted. If something big gets pulled from that account, I want to know immediately, and I want the bank paying attention immediately." Vanessa, in that meeting, asked exactly one question. She said, "So if I needed money quickly for any reason, it's just there. I don't have to ask anyone first." Phil said, "Correct. Up to the $2 million ceiling, the funds are available instantly, the same as if they were sitting in the account already. The notification and review triggers happen after the draw, not before. Nothing stops the transaction from executing in real time." I watched her face when Phil said that. At the time, I read it as relief, a daughter grateful that her father had built her a safety net. I understand now that I was reading the wrong emotion entirely. We signed the paperwork. The joint account opened in June of 2020 with an initial balance of $40,000, $25,000 from Gordon as a wedding gift, $10,000 from me, $5,000 from Vanessa, with the $2 million overdraft facility sitting behind it, invisible, unused, the specific kind of financial architecture that most people go their entire lives never having to think about because it never gets triggered. Over the following year, the account grew. We both contributed monthly. Wedding vendor deposits came out of it. By the middle of 2021, 3 months before the wedding date, the balance sat at just under $210,000, reflecting both our contributions and an additional gift Gordon had made toward the venue costs. I want to tell you now about the 6 weeks before the wedding, because that is when everything I believed about my relationship with Vanessa turned out to be built on a floor that was not actually there. In late July of 2021, I noticed a change in Vanessa's schedule. Additional evening client meetings that ran later than her previous late meetings ever had. A specific new attentiveness to her phone that had not been there before. The particular defensive posture people take with a device when they are managing something they do not want visible. I did what I had done my entire professional life, when a pattern did not match the surface explanation. I looked closer. I am not going to pretend that what I did next was entirely comfortable, or that I am proud of every part of it. I checked her location on a shared family tracking app we had set up during a work trip scare a year earlier and never disabled. I noticed a consistent pattern of evenings spent at a specific address in Shadyside that did not correspond to any client she had mentioned to me. I drove past that address once, on a Thursday evening in early August, and I saw her car parked in the driveway of a townhouse belonging, according to public property records I checked the following morning, to a man named Trevor Ashcombe, 38, a partner at a private wealth management firm downtown. I did not confront her immediately. I am my father's son, and my father's son does not act on incomplete information. I spent the following 10 days building the complete picture, quietly, the same way I would build a credit file on a company I was evaluating, methodically, without emotion, gathering every piece of evidence before drawing a conclusion. By the third week of August, the picture was complete, and it was worse than I had let myself imagine. Trevor Ashcombe and Vanessa had been involved for approximately 4 months. The relationship was not incidental. It was, based on messages I eventually saw and conversations I eventually had, something Vanessa had been actively building toward a specific outcome, one that involved leaving me, but not before extracting as much value from our shared situation as she believed she could. I confronted her on a Sunday evening, 3 weeks before our wedding date, in our apartment. I did not raise my voice. I have never once in my life believed that raising my voice produced a better outcome than staying level did. I said, "Vanessa, I know about Trevor." She was quiet for a long moment. She said, "How long have you known?" I said, 3 weeks. I wanted the complete picture before I said anything. She said, "Of course you did." There was something in her voice in that moment that told me she had already, mentally, moved past the relationship and into whatever came next, and that whatever came next had been planned with the same care I had once admired in her. She said, "I was going to tell you after the wedding." I said, "After the wedding?" She said, "It's complicated, Daniel." I said, "It's not complicated. You were going to marry me while seeing someone else, and you were going to figure out the rest afterward." She did not deny it. The wedding was called off that week. The vendors were canceled, most of the deposits lost, the invitations already mailed sitting unopened in mailboxes across 3 states. What I did not expect, in the weeks that followed, was what Vanessa decided to do with the account. The 6 weeks after the wedding was called off were the strangest 6 weeks of my adult life, in the specific sense that grief and administration happened simultaneously and demanded equal attention at the same time. I was canceling a marriage. I was also in the background, still going to work every day, still running credit models for companies that had no idea my personal life had detonated, still being the version of myself that showed up. Vanessa moved out of the apartment we shared within 10 days. She moved, as it turned out, into Trevor Ashcombe's townhouse in Shadyside, a fact she did not bother to hide once the wedding was officially called off, since hiding no longer served any purpose for her. We did not speak much in those weeks. What we did discuss, through a handful of terse text exchanges, was the joint account, specifically, how the remaining balance would be divided, since both of our names were on it and both of us had contributed to it over the previous 14 months. I proposed in early September a straightforward split reflecting actual contributions. I had put in slightly more than she had. Gordon's contributions I proposed splitting evenly, since they had been a gift to the wedding rather than to either of us individually. Vanessa did not respond to that proposal directly. What she did instead, on a Tuesday morning in the third week of September, was transfer the entire remaining balance of the joint account, $231,000, reflecting a final contribution Gordon had made toward what was supposed to have been the honeymoon, into a separate account. And from there, within the same hour, initiate a wire for a non-refundable 11-day stay at a 5-star resort in Providenciales, Turks and Caicos, along with first-class airfare for two. I found out about the transfer the way I found out about most things involving Vanessa in that period, not from her, but from the bank's own systems, because I was sitting in a meeting 3 floors above where the transaction was processed when an internal alert crossed a screen I happened to be looking at. I want to explain exactly why I saw it, because it matters. 3 Rivers Financial Group had, as most banks do, an automated internal alert system that flagged any transaction across specific thresholds for review by risk management, regardless of which relationship manager technically owned the account. I was not monitoring Vanessa's account. I had, in fact, gone out of my way for 14 months to never look at it, exactly as I had promised Gordon I would. But the transfer amount, combined with the subsequent overdraft trigger, produced an automatic flag that crossed the desk of the risk committee I sat on as a matter of standard institutional procedure, because any transaction that activated a commercial credit facility secured against a business client's line required risk committee visibility, no matter whose personal account initiated it. I did not immediately understand what I was looking at. I saw a flagged transaction referencing an overdraft draw against a secured facility tied to Kessler Building Group. I did not, in that first moment, connect it to Vanessa because I had spent 14 months deliberately not thinking about that account at all. It was Phil Danziger, 2 cubicles down, who put it together first. He came to my desk that afternoon, looking uncomfortable in the specific way of someone about to deliver information they know is going to land badly. He said, "Daniel, do you have a minute?" I said, "Sure." He said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand I'm asking because of a compliance requirement, not because I think you did anything." I said, "Okay." He said, "The joint account you and Vanessa Kessler hold. There was a transfer out this morning of $231,000, followed by an overdraft draw of just under $60,000 against the $2 million facility secured by Gordon Kessler's business." I sat with that for a moment. I said, $60,000. He said, "Yes." I said, "What was it for?" He said, "I can't share the specific transaction detail with you directly since your name is on the account, and I need to maintain appropriate separation given the personal relationship. But I can tell you that a draw over $50,000 triggers the mandatory credit review clause we discussed at signing. Gordon's entire commercial facility is now subject to review, effective this week, ahead of his normal annual cycle." I understood in that instant, with the specific clarity that comes from spending 9 years modeling exactly this kind of mechanism, precisely what had happened. Vanessa had emptied the joint balance. Then, needing additional funds to cover the resort stay and airfare in full, she had drawn against the overdraft facility her father had built specifically to protect her from ever having to ask anyone for money in an emergency. She had used it, not for an emergency, but for a vacation with the man she had been seeing throughout our engagement. And in doing so, she had triggered a mandatory review of her own father's company's entire credit relationship with the bank, 4 months ahead of schedule, at a moment when, and this detail I only learned over the following days, Kessler Building Group was in the middle of bidding on the largest municipal contract in the company's history, a project that required the bank to issue a substantial new performance bond facility, contingent on the company's existing credit standing, remaining exactly where it had been at the last review. I called Gordon that evening. I want to be honest that I debated, for several hours, whether calling him was appropriate given everything that had happened between Vanessa and me. I decided in the end that Gordon had built that facility in good faith, had trusted me with the full explanation of the mechanism at the time he built it, and deserved to hear from someone who understood exactly what was happening before the bank's formal notification letter arrived and told him in the cold language of a compliance department. He picked up on the second ring. He said, "Daniel, I heard about you and Vanessa. I'm sorry." I said, "Gordon, I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand I'm telling you as a courtesy, not because I have any professional obligation to." He said, "Go ahead." I said, "This morning, Vanessa drew down just under $60,000 against the overdraft facility on the joint account. Combined with the full balance she transferred out beforehand, she's used the entire account plus a meaningful piece of the protection you set up for her." There was a long silence. He said, "For what?" I said, "I don't know the specific transaction detail, but given the timing and everything else going on, I have a strong guess." He said, "The resort thing, Trevor." I said, "You know about Trevor?" He said, "Her mother told me 2 weeks ago. I didn't say anything to you because it wasn't my place, and because I was hoping it would resolve itself before it became your problem or mine." I said, "Gordon, there's something more important than the money itself. That draw just triggered a mandatory credit review on your entire facility with the bank. I don't sit on Phil's book, so I can't tell you exactly how it will play out, but I know the mechanism, and I know the timing is not good, given what I understand about your bond application for the county contract." Another long silence. He said, "How bad is the timing?" I said, "I think you need to call Phil first thing tomorrow morning and get ahead of it rather than waiting for the notification letter." He said, "I will." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Daniel, I want you to know something. When I set that facility up, I told you I trusted the people who'd have access to it. I meant that. I trusted my daughter with it because she is my daughter, and because I genuinely believed I had raised her to understand what a safety net like that is actually for." I said, "I know you did, Gordon." He said, "I was wrong about that, apparently, in a way I did not see coming." I said, "I think we're both finding out things this month that we didn't see coming." He laughed once without much humor in it. He said, "Yes, I suppose we are." Gordon called Phil Danziger at 8 the following morning, before Phil had even finished his coffee, and asked for a full and direct explanation of what the draw meant for Kessler Building Group's credit standing. Phil, bound by the specific procedures a mandatory review triggers, explained that the bank's credit committee, the same committee I sat on, which meant I would, in the strange and uncomfortable turn events had taken, be present for at least the analytical portion of the review of my former future father-in-law's company, though I recused myself from any vote given the personal conflict, would need to reassess the entirety of Kessler Building Group's credit relationship within 30 days, rather than at the scheduled annual review 4 months out. This mattered enormously for one specific reason. Kessler Building Group was, at that exact moment, in the final stage of bidding for a $42 million municipal contract to construct a new regional wastewater treatment facility for Allegheny County. The bid required Gordon's company to secure a performance bond of nearly $6 million from a surety provider, and the surety provider's underwriting decision was contingent, in significant part, on a letter of credit confirmation from Three Rivers Financial Group affirming the company's current standing and its available credit capacity. That letter of credit confirmation had been scheduled to go out the following week, based on Kessler Building Group's most recent quarterly financials, which were strong. Revenue was up, margins were healthy. The company's debt-to-equity position was, by any reasonable standard, in excellent shape. But the mandatory review, triggered by Vanessa's draw, meant the letter could not go out until the full review concluded, and the review, once opened, required the committee to examine not just the company's standalone financials, but the entire secured facility structure, including the overdraft line attached to the personal account, meaning the county's surety provider, and by extension the county's contract award committee, would become aware, through the delay alone, that something irregular had occurred on a facility tied to Kessler Building Group's credit. Gordon understood immediately what this meant. A $42 million contract, the largest in his company's history, put at genuine risk not because of anything wrong with his business, but because his daughter had wanted a vacation. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to overstate my own role in what happened next. I was not on Phil's account team. I recused myself from any vote on the Kessler review the moment it was raised, and I said so formally, in writing, to my own supervisor, precisely because I understood how it would look otherwise. What I did do, and what I think mattered, was walk Gordon through the mechanics of what an accelerated but clean review actually required, using the exact knowledge Carol Petrosky had spent years building in me. I told him on a call the following evening, "Gordon, the review is not actually bad news for you if your numbers are what you've told me they are. A mandatory review triggered by an overdraft draw is a procedural event. It does not automatically mean anything negative about your company. What it means is that the bank has to look, formally and on a compressed timeline, at everything. If your financials are clean, and I have no reason to think they aren't, the review should conclude in your favor. The real risk is the delay itself, and whether the surety provider is patient enough to wait for it." Gordon said, "What do I do about the surety provider?" I said, "Get ahead of them too. Call them yourself tomorrow morning, before the delay becomes visible to them through normal channels. Tell them exactly what happened. A personal account irregularity unrelated to the company's operating performance triggered an accelerated review, that you expect it to conclude within 2 weeks, and that you are providing full transparency rather than waiting for them to discover a delay and wonder why." He said, "You think honesty is the right play here?" I said, "I think a construction company with 30 years of clean performance can survive being honest about a 2-week delay caused by something outside its control. What it can't survive is a surety provider discovering the delay on their own and wondering what you were hiding." Gordon took that advice. The review, which I want to be clear I had no formal role in conducting, concluded 11 days later. Kessler Building Group's financials were exactly what Gordon had said they were: clean, well-managed, entirely capable of supporting the credit facility at its existing level. The letter of credit confirmation went out to the surety provider 4 days behind the original schedule, accompanied by Gordon's own direct explanation of the delay, which the surety underwriter, according to what Gordon told me afterward, appreciated more than she penalized. Kessler Building Group won the county contract in November. Vanessa, meanwhile, returned from Turks and Caicos on the same Tuesday. The mandatory review was formally opened, entirely unaware, for the first several days, of what her transfer had actually triggered. She found out the way Gordon told me she found out, over a dinner at her parents' house, roughly 2 weeks after she returned, when Gordon sat her down and explained, calmly and completely, exactly what had happened. He told me about that conversation himself, some weeks later, over a coffee he asked me to have with him, which I want to describe honestly because I think it is the part of this story that matters most. He said, "I told her the full mechanism, the overdraft, the trigger, the review, the county contract, all of it." I asked him, how did she take it? He said, "She didn't understand at first how a personal vacation could have anything to do with my business. I had to explain it to her 3 times before it landed. And when it landed, she didn't apologize for what she'd done to you. She apologized for the money. That told me something I needed to understand about my daughter that I had spent 30 years not wanting to see clearly." I said, "What did you tell her?" He said, "I told her that the facility was never a gift with no strings. It was trust with a mechanism attached, and she had spent both without understanding either. I told her that a $2 million safety net only stays invisible if you never need to touch it for the wrong reasons, and that she had just taught me, at 59 years old, that I had misjudged who I could hand that kind of trust to." He said, "I closed the facility the following week. Not the account, she can keep whatever's left of that, it's a small amount now anyway. But the overdraft line is gone. If she ever needs money urgently again, she calls me directly, and I decide, the way I should have been doing from the start, instead of building a mechanism that let her bypass that conversation entirely." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "Gordon, I want you to know I didn't tell you any of this to get back at Vanessa. I told you because you'd built that facility in good faith, and you deserve to know what was happening to it before a letter told you coldly." He said, "I know that. That's actually the thing I keep thinking about. You had every reason to let this play out in silence and let my company take whatever hit was coming, and you didn't. You picked up the phone instead." I said, "That's just what my father raised me to do. You show up, even when it costs you something not to." Gordon nodded slowly. He said, "Your father raised you well, Daniel. I'm sorry my daughter didn't get raised with quite the same clarity, whatever I told myself for 30 years. Here is what I want you to understand about the $2 million that never actually got spent. The number that sat quietly in the background of an ordinary joint account for 14 months, and then, for one reckless week, became the most consequential number in 3 people's lives at once. It was never really about the money. Gordon built that overdraft facility because he loved his daughter and wanted her protected from the specific fear every parent carries. The fear of getting a call in the middle of the night that they can't answer fast enough. He built a mechanism instead of a habit. He gave Vanessa access instead of a relationship where she would simply call him and ask. And the gap between those two things, access without connection, safety nets without conversations, is exactly where the entire story fell through. Vanessa did not see the overdraft facility as a trust. She saw it as a resource, sitting there, waiting to be used the moment she wanted something and didn't want to ask anyone's permission to have it. That is not a flaw unique to her. It is what happens, I think, whenever people are given access to protection without ever being asked to understand what that protection actually costs someone else. I did not set out at any point in this story to expose her or to punish her. I want to be completely honest about that, because I think the version of this story that would be easiest to tell is the version where I engineered her downfall out of heartbreak. That is not what happened. What happened is simpler and, I think, more useful to anyone listening to this who has ever built a safety net for someone they love. The mechanism did the work on its own. It always does. Structures built quietly, with real thought behind them, tend to reveal exactly what they were designed to reveal, whether that is protection for someone who needs it or exposure for someone who abuses it. I did not need to do anything except understand the mechanism clearly enough to explain it honestly to the one person who deserved to hear it directly from someone who respected him. Gordon Kessler's company is thriving. The county contract is under construction now, on schedule, and it will likely be the largest single project in the firm's history when it's finished next year. Gordon and I still have coffee every few months, not because either of us needs anything from the other, but because we built, out of the wreckage of an engagement that ended badly, an honest respect that neither of us expected and that both of us, I think, needed. Vanessa and Trevor are still together, as far as I know. I don't check anymore. I stopped checking the month after that dinner where Gordon told her the truth about the mechanism she had triggered, because by then I understood that whatever came next for her was no longer any of my business, and that the healthiest thing I could do with my own life was let it stop being my business. I am, as of this year, engaged again, to a woman named Priya who works as an ER physician and who has never once, in the 18 months I've known her, Ask me for anything without a conversation first. We are opening a joint account of our own next spring. There will be no overdraft facility attached to it, secured against anyone's business. There will just be two people who talk to each other before either of us needs something urgently. That, I have come to believe, is the actual safety net, not the mechanism, the habit of asking. If any part of this story landed with you, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel and ring the bell, because every week I bring you a story that is real and that goes somewhere you don't expect. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in Gordon's position, building a safety net for someone you love. Tell me if you've ever seen trust get spent the way a line of credit gets spent, quietly, until the moment it isn't quiet anymore. I read every comment, every single one. Thank you for being here.